Hey guys, welcome back to another journey with the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're venturing into Kazakhstan, a land so vast it could comfortably fit Western Europe inside it with room left over for a decent-sized parking lot. Picture this. Endless steppes that stretch beyond the horizon, snow-capped mountains that touch the sky, and a history so rich it makes other countries slightly envious of their cultural inheritance. From the ancient Silk Road caravans that crossed these plains to the modern cosmonauts who launch into space from the Kazakh steppes, this is a country where nomadic wisdom meets nuclear technology, where traditional hospitality coexists with cutting-edge mining operations, and where the past and future shake hands over cups of fermented mare's milk, which, trust me, tastes better than it sounds. Tonight, we'll explore how Kazakhstan became the world's 9th largest country, discover why horses were more important than cars for over a millennium, and uncover how a landlocked nation ended up controlling humanity's gateway to the stars. It's a story of adaptation, resilience, and the kind of strategic thinking that would make chess grandmasters take notes. If you find yourself drifting off during our exploration, which is entirely the point, make sure you're subscribed so you can continue this journey with us through every corner of our fascinating world. So find your most comfortable position, take a deep breath, and let's begin our gentle descent into the heart of Kazakhstan. Chapter 1. The Land of Endless Steppes, Geography and Climate. Kazakhstan sits like a sleeping giant in the heart of Central Asia, sprawling across 2.7 million square kilometers of some of the most diverse terrain our planet has to offer. To put this in perspective, Kazakhstan is roughly the size of Western Europe, or about 4 times the size of Texas, though thankfully with significantly fewer cowboys arguing about barbecue recipes. It's the 9th largest country in the world, which means it's big enough to have its own weather systems, time zones, and probably a few undiscovered species of very confused migratory birds. Picture, if you will, a landlocked nation that somehow manages to feel both infinite and intimate at the same time. Kazakhstan stretches from the Caspian Sea in the west, which despite its name, is actually a lake having an identity crisis, all the way to the Altai Mountains in the east, where the landscape suddenly decides it wants to be dramatic and starts reaching toward the sky like an over-enthusiastic theatre student. This is a country that shares borders with Russia to the north, China to the east, and the Central Asian republics of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan to the south. It's like being the middle child in a very large, very complicated family dinner where everyone speaks different languages and has strong opinions about whose turn it is to do the dishes. The geography of Kazakhstan reads like a choose-your-own-adventure book written by someone with a particularly vivid imagination and possibly too much coffee. In the north, you'll find the Great Kazakh Steppe, a grassland so vast and flat that it makes the American Great Plains look like a modest putting green. This is where the earth seems to stretch on forever, painted in every shade of green and gold imaginable, depending on the season and the mood of the weather gods. The steppe is broken only by occasional hills that rise from the landscape like gentle giants awakening from a 1,000-year nap. Travel south and west, and you'll encounter something entirely different, the deserts that make up a significant portion of Kazakhstan's territory. The Kizilkum Desert in the southwest is a place where the sun reigns supreme and the sand dunes shift like sleeping cats, constantly rearranging themselves when no one is looking. Here the landscape takes on an almost alien quality, with rock formations that look like they were sculpted by artists who had very specific ideas about what the end of the world should look like. But Kazakhstan isn't content to be just steppes and deserts. Oh no, this country has ambition. In the southeast, The Tian Shan mountains rise up with all the drama of a Shakespearean soliloquy, their snow-capped peaks reaching heights of over 7,000 meters. These mountains don't just provide stunning scenery, they're also home to glaciers that feed many of Kazakhstan's rivers and provide a crucial source of fresh water for a country that otherwise might find itself in some rather dry situations. The eastern regions bring us to the Altai Mountains, a range that Kazakhstan shares with Russia, Mongolia, and China in what must be one of the world's most geographically ambitious time-sharing agreements. These mountains are ancient beyond imagination, their weathered peaks telling stories that predate human civilization by millions of years. They're covered in forests of spruce, fir, and larch, trees that have clearly made peace with the idea of extremely cold winters and have developed the botanical equivalent of a very thick winter coat. Now, let's talk about water, because in a largely arid country like Kazakhstan, water is more precious than a parking spot in downtown Manhattan. The Irtysh River, flowing in from Russia, is the country's longest waterway and serves as a liquid highway through the northern regions. It's joined by the Ishim River, which flows through the capital city of Nur-Sultan, a city that was formerly known as Astana, and before that, Akmola, proving that even rivers have to deal with bureaucratic name changes. In the south, the Syr Darya River once flowed majestically toward the Aral Sea, carrying the dreams and irrigation hopes of countless communities. I say once because the Syr Darya now finds itself starring in one of the modern world's most tragic environmental stories. But we'll get to that heartbreaking tale in just a moment, because first, we need to appreciate the sheer audacity of Kazakhstan's lake system. Lake Balkhash, sitting proudly in the central eastern part of the country, is like the middle child of Central Asian lakes. Not quite as famous as the Aral Sea or the Caspian, but with its own special charm and a fascinating split personality. The western part of the lake contains fresh water, while the eastern section is saltier than a sailor's vocabulary after a particularly difficult day at sea. This Jekyll and Hyde approach to salinity is caused by a narrow strait that connects the two halves, creating what is essentially an aquatic boundary that fish probably need passports to cross. And then there's Lake Zaysan in the east, a high-altitude lake that sits in a depression surrounded by mountains like nature's own punch bowl. This lake has the distinction of being one of the oldest lakes in the world, having existed for over 50 million years. To put this in perspective, Lake Zaysan was already middle-aged when the dinosaurs were still trying to figure out why they suddenly felt so cold. But no discussion of Kazakhstani water features would be complete without addressing the elephant in the room, or rather the disappearing sea in the desert. The Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake in the world, has become the poster child for environmental catastrophe and a cautionary tale about what happens when humans decide they know better than nature. What was once a thriving inland sea, supporting fishing communities and providing moisture to the surrounding climate, has shrunk to less than 10% of its original size. The Aral Sea's tragedy began in the 1960s when Soviet central planners, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the Amu Darya and Syr Darya rivers would be better used for cotton irrigation than for, maintaining a massive body of water that had existed for millions of years. It's like deciding that the Amazon rainforest would make an excellent parking lot, technically possible, but perhaps not the wisest long-term strategy. Today, where ships once sailed across blue waters, there are now rusty fishing vessels sitting on cracked earth, looking like confused metal whales that took a seriously wrong turn. The former seabed has become a source of salt and dust storms that affect the health of people across the region. It's a sobering reminder that even the largest geographical features are not immune to human intervention, and that sometimes our attempts to improve upon nature have consequences that echo across generations. The climate of Kazakhstan is what meteorologists like to call continental, which is a polite way of saying, prepare for temperature swings that would make a teenager's mood seem stable. This is a land where summer temperatures can soar above 40 degrees Celsius, while winter temperatures plummet to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Yes, that's an 80-degree temperature range, which means that Kazakhstanis need wardrobes that can handle everything from Arctic exploration to desert survival, preferably within the same calendar year. Winters in Kazakhstan are not for the faint of heart. This is when the steppe transforms into a frozen ocean of snow and ice, and the wind howls across the landscape with the enthusiasm of an opera singer who's had too much coffee. The Siberian high-pressure system settles over the region like a cold, invisible blanket, bringing temperatures that can freeze your thoughts before you finish thinking them. It's during these months that Kazakhstanis demonstrate their remarkable resilience, continuing their daily lives in conditions that would send most warm-weather creatures scurrying for the nearest heated building. But when spring arrives, Kazakhstan undergoes one of nature's most spectacular transformations. The snow melts, revealing grass that's been sleeping under its white blanket, and suddenly the steppe explodes into life. Wildflowers paint the landscape in colours so vibrant they would make a rainbow jealous, and the air fills with the sounds of birds who've returned from their winter vacations in warmer climates, probably with stories about how tough they are for surviving a Kazakhstani winter. Summer brings its own brand of intensity. The sun beats down on the steppe with enthusiasm that borders on aggressive, creating heat mirages that make the horizon dance like it's auditioning for a music video. This is when the grasslands turn golden, waving in the wind like nature's own wheat field, and when anyone with sense seeks shade wherever they can find it. The summer thunderstorms are legendary, massive displays of atmospheric drama that light up the sky and remind everyone that Mother Nature has quite the flair for special effects. Autumn in Kazakhstan is perhaps the most beautiful season, when the landscape settles into shades of gold and amber that would make any photographer weep with joy. The air becomes crisp and clear, perfect for those deep breaths that make you feel like you're drinking pure sky. It's a time when the country seems to pause and take stock of itself before winter returns, with its annual reminder that life on the steppe requires both courage and excellent central heating. Beneath all this dramatic geography lies one of the Earth's greatest treasure troves of natural resources. Kazakhstan sits atop what can only be described as a geological lottery win. The country possesses the world's largest uranium reserves, which explains why it's become such an important player in the global nuclear industry. It's also rich in oil, natural gas, copper, zinc and gold. Basically, if it can be mined and sold, Kazakhstan probably has it hiding somewhere under its vast steppes. The Tengiz oil field in the west is one of the largest oil discoveries of the 20th century, containing reserves that could keep the global economy lubricated for decades to come. The Kashagan oil field beneath the Caspian Sea is another petroleum giant, though extracting oil from under a sea while dealing with extreme weather conditions has proven to be roughly as challenging as performing surgery while riding a roller coaster. This abundance of natural resources has shaped Kazakhstan's relationship with the world and its own development in profound ways. It's both a blessing and a challenge, providing enormous wealth while also making the country a target for international interest that isn't always entirely benevolent. Managing such vast natural wealth while building a sustainable, diversified economy has become one of Kazakhstan's great modern challenges. As we drift towards sleep, imagine yourself standing on the great Kazakh steppe on a clear night. Above you stretches a sky so vast and unpolluted that the Milky Way appears like a river of stars flowing across the darkness. The silence is profound, not empty, but full of the kind of peace that only comes from truly wild places. This is Kazakhstan, a land of extremes and contradictions, where ancient nomadic traditions meet modern ambitions, where the earth reaches toward infinity in every direction, and where the very landscape seems to whisper stories of all the peoples who have called this remarkable place home. Chapter 2: Ancient Roots, Prehistoric to Medieval Times. Long before modern borders carved up the Great Steppe, the vast grasslands of Kazakhstan were writing history in hoofbeats and arrow flights. This is where humanity first learned to ride the wind on horseback, where nomadic empires rose and fell like seasons, and where the very concept of the wandering warrior became legend. To understand Kazakhstan is to understand that this land was never empty. It was simply full of movement, full of peoples who measured wealth in horses rather than buildings. The earliest chapters of Kazakhstan's human story stretch back into the Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 years before Christ, when the Andronovo culture flourished across these steppes. These early inhabitants were already experimenting with metallurgy, creating bronze tools and weapons that would have made their contemporaries quite envious if they had known such sophisticated techniques existed in what they might have considered the middle of nowhere. The arrival of iron changed everything, ushering in what historians call the Scythian period. The earliest Iron Age burials associated with nomad warrior cultures were identified in the eastern fringes of the Kazakh steppe, with archaeological evidence pointing to a Kazakh steppe origin. These were the ancestors of peoples who had become known across the ancient world for their incredible skill with horses and their rather unnerving habit of appearing on the horizon when you least expected them. Around 800 to 600 years before Christ, the established tribes of the Sacs, also known as the Scythians in the west, dominated the region. The Sacs were not your ordinary neighbours. They were a diverse confederation of peoples who had mastered the art of living on horseback to such a degree that they probably felt more comfortable in a saddle than on solid ground. The term Saka historically referred to numerous tribes living in present-day Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and Afghanistan between the 8th century BCE and the 1st centuries of our era. The Persian Empire, in its methodical way of cataloguing everything, divided the Saka peoples into convenient categories. The Behistun inscription mentions the Saka Tigraksauda Saka with pointy hats and the Saka Hamavaga Hama drinking Saka. The pointy hats were practical nomadic fashion designed to protect against harsh steppe weather while looking appropriately intimidating. As for the Halma drinking Saka, they were well known for their fondness for fly agaric mushrooms and either indulged in narcotic brews or, according to some accounts, turned into wolves after consuming them. The Saka were remarkable for their sophisticated understanding of power and governance. They belonged to an early class society having 3 estates: chiefs, priests, and community members. The king was considered chosen by the gods as a mediator between heaven and mortals. This divine kingship concept would echo through the centuries, influencing later nomadic empires. The wealth of Saka society can still be seen in the magnificent burial mounds they left behind. Some reach heights of 16 meters with diameters of 150 meters. These weren't just graves. They were massive construction projects requiring thousands of working days. The Issyk burial mound, where a Saka king was buried, would have taken a worker 4,000 days to complete. The fact that supposedly nomadic peoples could organize such enormous building projects tells us our understanding of nomadic might need revision. The artistic achievements of the Saka peoples were equally impressive. Their art is expressed through the animal style, manifesting their mythology and worldview. Golden plaques showing eagles, deer, and mythical creatures weren't just jewelry. They were statements of identity, maps of cosmology, and probably conversation starters at ancient dinner parties. Perhaps the most significant development wasn't political or artistic, it was technological. The peoples of the Kazakhstani steppe were among the first to fully master mounted warfare. The horse archer, a warrior who could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, became the terror of sedentary civilizations from China to Greece. This military innovation would dominate Eurasian warfare for over a millennium. The nomadic lifestyle was far more sophisticated than modern ears might suggest. These weren't random wanderers. They followed carefully planned seasonal migration patterns refined over generations. The Kazakhs had a special word for this, kosh, referring to seasonal movement between winter and summer pastures. This was an intricate system of resource management that allowed the land to recover while providing optimal conditions for livestock. As centuries passed, new powers emerged. The Huns, who would later strike terror into the Roman Empire, originated in the vast grasslands of Central Asia. They were a group of nomadic warriors from the territories south and southeast of the Altai Mountains in the 2nd to 3rd centuries before Christ, perfecting the nomadic military machine to coordinate massive cavalry formations across enormous distances. The arrival of the Turkic Khaganate in the 6th century marked another crucial chapter. In the second half of the 6th century, Semirekiye and South Kazakhstan became parts of the Turkic Khaganate, a huge nomadic empire stretching from Korea to the Black Sea. This empire was so vast that a messenger riding at breakneck speed would need several months to cross from one end to the other, assuming he didn't get lost, eaten by wolves, or distracted by the scenery. The Turkic Khaganate brought something new, the first written records in a Turkic language. It was the first Turkic state to use the name Turk politically, and is known for the first written record of any Turkic language in history. These stone inscriptions were like ancient billboards announcing Turkic power, and provide invaluable insights into nomadic empire thinking. The relationship between the Turkic Khaganate and trade was complex. Turkic Khagans controlled the greater part of the Eastern Silk Road and huge silk reserves, but they didn't have trade skills. They were brave warriors, excellent hunters, and pastoralists who often treated trade with contempt. This attitude created both opportunities and problems, as controlling trade routes provided enormous wealth, while traditional nomadic values sometimes hindered full capitalization. The Silk Road's passage through Kazakhstan created a network of crucial cities and trading centers. The largest were Suyab, Taraz and Ispitshab, cosmopolitan centers where ideas, technologies and cultures mixed like ingredients in a medieval food court. Suyab was the first capital of the Western Turkic Khaganate, formed in 581 as a busy trade center where merchants from different countries gathered for annual fairs. The medieval city of Otrar deserves special mention for its tragic role in history. An important Silk Road trading post that minted its own coins, Otrar's defiance led to catastrophe. In 1219, Genghis Khan attacked Otrar and massacred both its ruler and populace. This wasn't just a local disaster, it opened floodgates for Mongol invasions that would reshape the medieval world. The Mongol conquest was like a historical earthquake whose aftershocks lasted centuries. Word of the Mongol hordes' approach spread terror and panic across vast territories. But the Mongols didn't just destroy, they created new political structures that would significantly influence Kazakhstani identity development. After Genghis Khan's death, his empire was divided among his sons. Joki received the lands around the Irtish River, the farthest from his father's homeland according to Mongol custom. This inheritance became the foundation of the Golden Horde, a Mongol state crucial to Kazakhstani identity formation. Despite its fearsome reputation, the Golden Horde was more than a military machine. It developed as a settled rather than nomadic culture, with Sarai becoming a populous and prosperous metropolis. This transformation from pure nomadism while maintaining nomadic traditions would become a recurring Kazakhstani theme, learning to live in two worlds simultaneously. One significant aspect was gradual conversion to Islam. Under Özbeg 1312-42, political power peaked and Islamic culture flourished under this energetic ruler whose name survives in Uzbekistan. This religious transformation connected steppe peoples to a vast Islamic civilization network stretching from Spain to Indonesia, bringing new legal systems, educational traditions, and cultural practices. The linguistic transformation was equally significant. Mongol language was abandoned for Turkic languages, and continuous intermarriage resulted in formation of a new Islamic population, the Tatars of Russia. This wasn't cultural obliteration but synthesis, as different peoples contributed heritage elements to create something entirely new. As the Golden Horde fragmented in the 14th and 15th centuries, the stage was set for the Kazakh Khanate's emergence. The process was like a slow crystallization of identity building for centuries. Various Turkic and Mongol peoples gradually coalesced around shared traditions, enemies, and independence dreams. The Kazakh Khanate's formation reads like a medieval political thriller. Beginning in 1459, several tribes dissatisfied with Abul-Khair's rule, led by Urus Khan's great-grandsons Janibek and Karay, fled the Uzbek Khanate in the Great Migration. This wasn't just moving to new pastures, it was a dramatic political statement, a declaration of independence echoing through centuries. Around 200,000 nomads joined Janibek and Karay Khan's movement, sparking fear in Abul-Khair. 200,000 people don't move on a whim. This was massive, coordinated migration requiring enormous planning, negotiation and courage. Like an entire city relocating, except this nomadic city had to move their entire way of life across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory. The Kazakh Khanate, formed around 1465 in the Semirekai region, was the first national state of the Kazakhs, laying foundations of modern statehood. The year 1465 was essentially a birth announcement for what would become modern Kazakhstan. The political structure was sophisticated and flexible, designed for people valuing both unity and autonomy. The Zhuz system arose as a pragmatic response to defense needs and pasture management across expansive steppes, integrating diverse Turkic and Mongol lineages into three major hordes: Uli Zhuz, Senior, Orta Zhuz, Middle, and Kishi Zhuz, Junior. These weren't just administrative divisions, but organic confederations reflecting natural steppe political structures. Each Zhuz had distinct character and specialization, functioning as military alliances enabling coordinated campaigns against threats. It was federalism before federalism was invented, allowing local autonomy while maintaining unity against common threats. Early decades involved almost constant warfare as the new state established legitimacy and secured borders. In 1470, Kazakhs defeated Shaybani at Iyasi, present-day Turkestan, forcing Uzbeks to retreat south. These weren't just battles but growing pains of a new nation asserting itself internationally. By 1500, Kazakhs achieved something remarkable. The Uzbeks concluded peace and recognized Kazakh sovereignty, transferring all former Uzbek lands north of Sirdarya to the Kazakh Khanate. This was formal recognition of Kazakh independence and legitimacy by former overlords. The zenith came under Qasim Khan, Janibek's son, ruling from 1511 to 23. Under his leadership, the Khanate expanded dramatically, becoming a regional power commanding respect from China to Russia. The Kazakh Khanate proved nomadic peoples could create complex political structures lasting centuries. Cultural achievements were equally significant. Islam adoption predated the Khanate's formation, though nomadic practices initially limited strict observance. By Quraysh and Janibek's establishment, Sunni Islam of the Hanafi madhab had become official ideology, creating unique Islam accommodating traditional steppe practices while connecting to the broader Islamic world. The period from Saka to early Kazakh Khanate represents gradual formation of distinctive Kazakhstani identity, combining nomadic traditions with settled civilization, Turkic culture with Islamic faith, and local autonomy with broader political structures. This millennium-long process involved countless migrations, wars, alliances, and cultural exchanges gradually coalescing into something recognizably Kazakhstani. Following these ancient peoples through great empires and the Kazakh nation's birth, we see characteristics that would define Kazakhstan for centuries. Adaptability facing changing circumstances, skill managing relationships with powerful neighbours, and maintaining cultural identity while embracing beneficial changes. These weren't just survival skills, they were foundations of a civilization stretching across Eurasia's heart. Chapter 3. Under the Russian Eagle, Imperial and Soviet Era. The relationship between Kazakhstan and Russia is one of history's great complicated friendships, the kind where one friend gradually moves into your house, rearranges all the furniture, and then claims they were always just trying to help with interior decorating. For over 2 centuries, the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union would fundamentally reshape Kazakhstan, bringing railroads and factories, schools and cities, but also bringing policies that would test the very survival of the Kazakh people. This is the story of how a nomadic society learned to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics, sometimes swimming with the current and sometimes nearly drowning in it. The first Russians to appear on Kazakh lands weren't conquerors, but rather a mixture of traders, soldiers, and Cossacks, essentially frontier entrepreneurs who had heard there might be opportunities in the vast eastern territories. Russian traders and soldiers began to appear on the northwestern edge of Kazakh territory in the 17th century, when Cossacks established the forts that later became the cities of Oryol and Atyrau. These early Russian outposts were like medieval strip malls, practical, not particularly attractive, but serving an important commercial purpose in connecting European Russia with Asian trade routes. The key to understanding Russia's gradual takeover of Kazakhstan lies in recognizing that it wasn't initially a grand imperial strategy so much as a case of convenient timing meeting opportunity. The Kazakhs were increasingly caught between the Kalmyks and the Russians, facing pressure from Mongol peoples moving west while Russian influence crept steadily eastward. It was like being squeezed in a very large, very slow-moving historical vice, where the only escape seemed to be picking the least uncomfortable side. The moment that changed everything came in 1730, when Abul Kaya, one of the Khans of the junior Jews, made a decision that would echo through the centuries. Although Abul Kaya's intent had been to form a temporary alliance against the stronger Kalmyks, the Russians gained permanent control of the junior Jews as a result of his decision. It was like asking a friend to help you move a couch and discovering 3 months later that they've somehow inherited your entire living room. Abul Kaya probably thought he was being diplomatically clever, but the Russians had a different interpretation of what assistance meant. The Russian approach to expansion was methodical and patient, like a chess player who thinks several moves ahead while their opponent is still trying to figure out which pieces do what. By the late 18th century, Russia held a line of forts roughly along the current Kazakhstan border, creating a network of military outposts with names that sound like a roll call of Russian imperial ambition. Guriev, Uralsk, Orenburg, Orsk, Troitsk, Petropavlovsk, Omsk, Pavlodar, Semipalatinsk, and Ust-Kamenogorsk. These weren't just military installations, they were statements of intent, permanent Russian stamps on the Kazakh landscape. As the 19th century progressed, Russian control tightened like a slowly closing fist. The conquest of Kazakhstan by Russia was slowed by numerous uprisings and wars, including uprisings led by Izzetete Emanueli and Makambet Utamisiuli from 1836 to 38, and the war led by Izzete Kotibaruli from 1847 to 58. These weren't just military conflicts, they were cultural last stands, attempts by Kazakh leaders to preserve something of their traditional way of life against the steady encroachment of imperial administration. The year 1863 marked a turning point when the Russian Empire announced a new policy asserting the right to annex troublesome areas on its borders. This led immediately to the conquest of the remainder of Central Asia and the creation of two administrative districts, the governor-generalships of Russian Turkestan and the steppes. It was bureaucratic imperialism at its finest. The Russians had essentially decided that paperwork was mightier than the sword, and they were going to reorganize Central Asia whether it wanted to be reorganized or not. What made Russian colonization particularly devastating was its effect on the traditional nomadic economy. The construction of Russian forts began to limit the area over which the nomadic tribes could drive their herds and flocks, disrupting migration patterns that had been refined over centuries. It was like suddenly putting traffic lights in the middle of ancient highways, technically more organized, but completely incompatible with how the system had always worked. The final disruption of nomadism began in the 1890s, when many Russian settlers were introduced into the fertile lands of northern and eastern Kazakhstan. Between 1906 and 1912, more than 500,000 Russian farms were established as part of reforms by Russian Minister of the Interior Petr Stolypin. These weren't just individual farming families looking for new opportunities. This was demographic warfare, a systematic attempt to transform the ethnic composition and economic structure of Kazakhstan. The Russian settlements distorted the fundamentally important roots of nomadic seasonal repositioning that Kazakhs had employed for many centuries. Imagine if someone decided to build shopping malls on all the major highways during rush hour. That's essentially what happened to Kazakh migration patterns. The traditional rhythm of nomadic life, which had sustained Kazakh society for generations, was suddenly faced with fences, property lines, and agricultural settlements where there had once been open rangeland. The completion of the Trans-Ural Railway between Orenburg and Tashkent in 1906 further facilitated Russian colonization, turning what had once been a difficult journey across the steppes into a relatively convenient train ride. Railways have a way of making imperial control much more practical. Suddenly you can move troops, administrators, and settlers with the efficiency of a cosmic delivery service. The breaking point came in 1916, during World War I, when the Tsar ordered the conscription of non-Russian subjects into the Russian Imperial Army. For the Kazakhs, who had been promised that their integration into the Russian Empire wouldn't require military service, this felt like the final betrayal. Starving and displaced by land seizures, many Kazakhs joined what became known as the Central Asian Revolt against conscription. It was a rebellion born of desperation, the last gasp of a people who felt they had nothing left to lose. The revolt of 1916 was brutal and devastating, with casualties on all sides and reprisals that further decimated Kazakh communities. When the dust settled, traditional Kazakh society had been fundamentally broken, its political structures dismantled, its economic base destroyed, and its people scattered or subjugated. The old world of the Khans and the nomadic confederations was effectively dead. even before the Russian Revolution swept away the Tsarist system that had destroyed it. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 might have seemed like liberation for Kazakhstan, but what followed was even more traumatic. The Russian Revolution and subsequent civil war brought new forms of chaos and violence to the region. The Bolsheviks, when they finally consolidated power, had even more ambitious plans for transforming Kazakh society than the Tsars had ever dreamed of. The Soviet approach to Kazakhstan was based on a fundamental ideological problem. Karl Marx had theorized about workers and peasants, but he hadn't really considered what to do with nomads. The question became whether Kazakh nomads could speed through history and be transformed into successful factory workers and collective farmers. It was social engineering on a massive scale, an attempt to compress centuries of social evolution into a few decades of state-directed transformation. Stalin's first five-year plan, launched in 1929, was intended to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial powerhouse. For Kazakhstan, this meant collectivization, the violent consolidation of individual farms and herds into state-controlled collective farms. The policy was called collectivization, but for the Kazakhs, it was more accurately described as denomadization, the systematic destruction of nomadic life. The results were catastrophic beyond anything the Tsarist government had achieved. The famine that struck Kazakhstan between 1930 and 1933, known in Kazakh as Ashashi-like, was a direct result of Soviet collectivization policies implemented under First Secretary Philip Goloshkyokin. An estimated 1.3 to 2.3 million people died, 2,400, with 38 to 42% of all Kazakhs perishing, the highest proportion of any ethnic group killed in the Soviet famines of the early 1930s. The mechanics of this disaster were almost perfectly designed to destroy nomadic society. Traditionally, nomadic Kazakhs relied heavily on livestock herding, but collectivization destroyed this system. Herds were seized by the state, traditional migrations were disrupted, and communities were forced into collective farms ill-suited for the steppe environment. It was like forcing fish to live in trees and then wondering why they weren't thriving. The human cost was staggering. Entire villages were destroyed, with nothing remaining but abandoned huts, rows of corpses, and disease. Kazakhs who tried to flee faced brutal treatment at border crossings, with thousands being detained or killed while attempting to escape to China. The Soviet party system in Kazakhstan had difficulty projecting power over the immense distances of the sparsely populated republic, but it was remarkably efficient at preventing people from escaping the zones of famine. The demographic transformation was permanent and profound. Kazakhstan's population fell by more than a third, and Kazakhs were reduced from about 60% of the republic's inhabitants to 38%, making them a minority in their own homeland for decades. Large numbers of survivors fled permanently to China, Afghanistan, and other regions. The famine not only killed millions but also transformed the demographic and cultural landscape of Kazakhstan forever. After the immediate crisis passed, Kazakhstan became a key component of Soviet industrialization and militarization. During World War II, Kazakhstan served as a crucial rear base for the Soviet war effort, hosting evacuated factories and providing resources for the fight against Nazi Germany. Entire industrial complexes were relocated to Kazakhstan from western regions threatened by German advance, turning the republic into an unexpected industrial powerhouse. But perhaps the most ominous chapter of Soviet rule in Kazakhstan began in 1947, when the government established a secret town called Kurchatov to support the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. For over 40 years, the Soviet military tested nuclear bombs in the Kazakh steppe, conducting 456 nuclear tests between 1949 and 1989. The site, known as the Polygon, exposed an estimated 500,000 to 1.5 million people to dangerous levels of radiation. The selection of Kazakhstan for nuclear testing followed the same logic that had guided Russian imperial expansion. The assumption that the steppe was essentially empty and that the local population didn't matter. Stalin's security chief Lavrentiy Beria declared the area uninhabited, which was either willfully ignorant or deliberately deceptive. The 18,500 square kilometre polygon lay near the city of Semipalatinsk and numerous rural communities whose inhabitants became unwitting human subjects in a vast atomic experiment. The Soviet approach to nuclear testing showed the same disregard for local populations that had characterized Russian rule from the beginning. Residents were sometimes evacuated during tests, but often they were simply told to go outside and take cover, with officials claiming the explosions were earthquakes or mining operations. Children were taught to cover themselves with felt blankets when the earthquakes came, not knowing they were being exposed to life-threatening radiation. The health consequences were immediate and long-lasting. Cancer rates and genetic defects in children born in the area increased dramatically after the first tests, creating generations of people whose lives were shaped by invisible contamination. Birth defects, blindness, developmental disabilities, and premature deaths became tragically common in communities near the test site, though the Soviet government denied any connection to the nuclear program. The polygon represented the ultimate expression of colonial exploitation, the use of Kazakhstan as a testing ground for weapons that would protect the Soviet Union while devastating the local population. It was empire at its most callous, treating an entire region and its people as expendable resources in the service of great power competition. Throughout the Soviet period, Kazakhstan also served as a destination for deported populations from across the USSR, ethnic Germans, Koreans, Chechens, Ingush, and many other groups were forcibly relocated to Kazakhstan as part of Stalin's ethnic policies. These deportations transformed Kazakhstan into one of the most ethnically diverse republics in the Soviet Union, but they also meant that the republic was constantly absorbing traumatized populations who had been uprooted from their homelands. The irony of Soviet rule in Kazakhstan was that while it brought genuine modernization, cities, schools, hospitals, universities, and industrial development, it came at the cost of enormous human suffering and cultural destruction. Kazakhstan did become more prosperous and developed under Soviet rule, but the price paid in human lives and cultural continuity was devastating. By the late Soviet period, Kazakhstan had been thoroughly transformed. The nomadic society that had existed for centuries was gone, replaced by a modern republic with significant industrial capacity, urban centres, and educational institutions. But this modernization had come through trauma rather than organic development, creating a society that was simultaneously advanced and damaged, prosperous and scarred. The relationship between Kazakhstan and its imperial overlords, first Russian, then Soviet, reveals the complex dynamics of colonial rule in the modern era. Unlike some forms of colonialism, Russian and Soviet rule in Kazakhstan involved significant investment in local development and integration of local elites into imperial structures. But this development was imposed rather than chosen, and it consistently prioritized imperial needs over local welfare. As the Soviet Union entered its final decades, the accumulated costs of this imperial relationship would become increasingly apparent. Environmental degradation, demographic distortion, cultural disruption, and economic dependency all shaped Kazakhstan's experience as it moved toward independence. The challenge would be how to build a modern nation from the pieces left by centuries of imperial rule, keeping the schools and factories while healing the trauma, preserving the connections while asserting autonomy. Chapter 4: Independence and Nation Building. The morning of December 16th, 1991, dawned like any other winter day in Almaty, but by evening Kazakhstan had become an independent nation, though this independence came almost by accident. Kazakhstan was the last Soviet republic to declare independence, which means that for a brief, surreal period, Kazakhstan actually was the entire Soviet Union. It's like being the last person at a party who suddenly realizes they're now responsible for cleaning up and turning off all the lights. Except the party had lasted 70 years, and the cleanup involved building an entire country from scratch. The path to independence had been gradual rather than revolutionary. Unlike some Soviet republics that fought desperately for freedom, Kazakhstan found independence thrust upon it by the collapse of the system that had shaped it for decades. Following the failed August 1991 coup attempt in Moscow, the process accelerated, and Nazarbayev held an uncontested election for president of Kazakhstan on December 1st, 1991. The Kazakhstan Supreme Soviet then issued a declaration of independence on December 16th, making Kazakhstan the last domino to fall in the Soviet collapse. The man who would lead this newborn nation was Nursultan Nazarbayev, a career Soviet official who had risen through the ranks of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev was like a political chameleon, able to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining his position, a skill that would prove invaluable in navigating the treacherous transition from Soviet socialism to independent capitalism. He had been appointed first secretary of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan in 1989, and had watched the Soviet Union disintegrate around him while carefully positioning Kazakhstan for whatever came next. The early years of independence presented Kazakhstan with challenges that would have seemed overwhelming to any new nation, let alone one emerging from 7 decades of Soviet rule. The country inherited a bizarre assortment of Soviet legacy issues, a nuclear arsenal that made it the world's 4th largest nuclear power, an economy completely integrated into Soviet production chains, a population where ethnic Kazakhs were actually a minority in their own country, and environmental disasters that included radioactive testing sites and ecological catastrophes. One of Nazarbayev's first and most consequential decisions was to give up Kazakhstan's inherited nuclear weapons. Kazakhstan had served as a Soviet test range and missile launch site, and was left with some 1,400 Soviet strategic nuclear warheads when the Soviet Union collapsed. The new president could have chosen to keep these weapons as insurance against an uncertain future, but instead he cooperated closely with the United States to secure nuclear materials, transfer remaining nuclear weapons to Russia, and dismantle associated infrastructure. It was a decision that earned Kazakhstan international respect and demonstrated that this new nation intended to be a responsible member of the global community. The economic transformation of Kazakhstan was perhaps even more dramatic than its political independence. The Soviet economy had been like a giant machine where every part was designed to work with every other part, and when the machine broke down, each individual component had to figure out how to function on its own. Kazakhstan faced the challenge of transforming an economy that had been designed to serve Soviet needs into one that could thrive in global markets. This meant privatization, market reforms, and the painful process of allowing inefficient Soviet enterprises to fail while building new economic structures. Fortunately for Kazakhstan, the country was sitting on enormous natural resource wealth that would prove crucial during this transition period. Oil and gas reserves that had been developed to serve Soviet energy needs could now be exploited for Kazakhstan's own benefit. Starting from the early 2000s, The Kazakh economy faced huge growth thanks to its development in the energy sector and high oil prices. The discovery and development of major oil fields like Tengiz and Kashagan transformed Kazakhstan from a struggling post-Soviet economy into one of the most prosperous countries in Central Asia. Under Nazarbayev's leadership, Kazakhstan pursued what became known as a multi-vector foreign policy, which was essentially diplomatic juggling on a grand scale. The country sought to maintain good relations with Russia while also building partnerships with China, the United States, and Europe. This was like trying to be friends with 4 different groups who don't necessarily like each other, requiring considerable diplomatic skill and a clear understanding that Kazakhstan's survival depended on not picking sides in great power competition. The relationship with Russia remained particularly complex. Despite independence, Kazakhstan retained close military, political, economic, and cultural ties to Russia. Russian was still widely spoken. Much of Kazakhstan's trade still flowed through Russian networks, and many Russian and other Slavic residents remained in the country. Nazarbayev had to balance Kazakhstan's desire for genuine sovereignty with the practical reality that antagonizing Russia could have severe consequences for a landlocked country dependent on Russian cooperation for access to global markets. Meanwhile, relations with China grew increasingly important as that country's economy boomed. Nazarbayev prioritized strengthening relations with China through a pragmatic approach focused on economic cooperation, regional security, and border stability. Kazakhstan resolved long-standing border disputes with China through agreements in 1994, 1997, and 2002, finalizing their 1,700-kilometer boundary. The completion of oil and gas pipelines to China provided Kazakhstan with crucial alternative export routes, reducing dependence on Russia for energy exports. The United States became an important partner for Kazakhstan, particularly in the areas of nuclear security and economic development. The United States was the first country to recognize Kazakhstan's independence following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Since that time, the United States and Kazakhstan developed a strong and wide-ranging bilateral relationship, with American companies investing heavily in Kazakhstan's energy sector and the US government providing over $500 million in assistance to Kazakhstan's denuclearization and non-proliferation efforts. Domestically, Nazarbayev's approach to building the new Kazakhstani state was pragmatic rather than ideological. He believed that economic development should take priority over political liberalization, famously stating that the economy comes first, then politics. This approach reflected his understanding that Kazakhstan's diverse population and complex regional situation required stability above all else. Rather than rushing toward democracy, he chose to build economic prosperity and social cohesion first, believing that political reforms could come later once the country was more stable and prosperous. The demographic challenge facing Kazakhstan was enormous. As a result of Soviet policies, ethnic Kazakhs had become a minority in their own country, making up only about 40% of the population at independence. The rest of the population included Russians, Ukrainians, Germans, Koreans, and dozens of other ethnicities. Creating a sense of national unity among such a diverse population required careful balancing. Nazarbayev promoted Kazakh language and culture, while also guaranteeing rights for minority groups and maintaining Russian as an official language alongside Kazakh. The construction of a new capital city became one of the most visible symbols of Kazakhstan's independence and ambitions. In 1997, Nazarbayev announced that the capital would be moved from Almaty to Akmola, later renamed Astana. The decision seemed puzzling to many observers. Why move the capital from the cosmopolitan, mountain-ringed Almaty to a windswept city on the northern steppes? But the move was strategically brilliant, placing the new capital in a region with a large Russian population and demonstrating the government's commitment to developing the entire country, not just the south. The construction of Astana became a massive nation-building project. The city was designed to showcase Kazakhstan's modernity and ambitions, with futuristic architecture and ambitious urban planning. It was like building a crystal city in the middle of the steppe, a statement that Kazakhstan intended to be a modern, forward-looking nation rather than just another post-Soviet backwater. The city's development also provided employment and demonstrated the government's ability to complete major infrastructure projects. Economic diversification became increasingly important as Kazakhstan matured as an independent state. While oil and gas wealth provided the foundation for economic growth, overdependence on natural resources created vulnerabilities. The 2008 and 2014 price shocks revealed just how vulnerable the Kazakhstani economy was to oil prices, catalyzing efforts to reduce the country's dependence on fossil fuels and develop other sectors of the economy. Nazarbayev launched several far-reaching development strategies, most notably the Kazakhstan 2050 strategy announced in 2012, which aimed for Kazakhstan to take a place among the world's 30 most developed states by mid-century. This was an extraordinarily ambitious goal for a country that had only been independent for 2 decades, but it reflected the confidence that Kazakhstan's leadership had developed about their country's potential. The strategy included plans for economic diversification, technological advancement, and social development. The government focused on developing manufacturing capabilities, improving agricultural productivity, and building a modern service sector. The goal was to transform Kazakhstan from a resource-dependent economy into a modern, diversified nation that could compete globally across multiple sectors. Throughout the Nazarbayev era, Kazakhstan also worked to establish itself as a regional leader and mediator. The country hosted international conferences, mediated disputes between neighboring countries, and positioned itself as a bridge between different regions and civilizations. This diplomatic role enhanced Kazakhstan's international standing and demonstrated that the country had ambitions beyond simply managing its own internal development. Environmental issues remained a significant challenge throughout the independence period. The legacy of Soviet environmental destruction, from the Aral Sea disaster to radioactive contamination from nuclear testing, required enormous resources and long-term commitment to address. The government began clean-up efforts at nuclear test sites, worked on water management issues, and gradually developed environmental policies, though progress was often slow given the scale of the problems inherited from the Soviet era. As Kazakhstan entered the 2000s and 2010s, questions about political succession became increasingly important. Nazarbayev had been in power since before independence, and while he had brought stability and prosperity to the country, his continued rule raised questions about whether Kazakhstan was building institutions or simply depending on one man's leadership. The gradual introduction of some political reforms suggested that the government was aware of these concerns, but change remained incremental rather than dramatic. The surprising resignation of Nazarbayev in March 2019 marked a historic transition. After nearly 30 years in power, he stepped down and transferred presidential authority to Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, the chairman of the Senate. This was Kazakhstan's first peaceful transfer of power since independence, and it demonstrated that the country had developed sufficient institutional stability to manage leadership transitions without crisis. Tokayev brought a different approach to the presidency. A career diplomat with extensive international experience, he emphasized the need for political reforms alongside continued economic development. His stated belief was that political changes were necessary to achieve continued economic growth and social development. This represented a shift from Nazarbayev's economy-first approach to a more balanced focus on both political and economic modernization. Under Tokayev's leadership, Kazakhstan has faced new challenges and opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic tested the country's healthcare system and economic resilience, while geopolitical tensions surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 created new diplomatic challenges for Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy. The country has had to navigate carefully between maintaining its partnership with Russia while also demonstrating its commitment to international law and sovereignty. The January 2022 protests in Kazakhstan marked another significant moment in the country's political development. What began as demonstrations against fuel price increases escalated into broader protests about economic inequality and political representation. The government's response included both repressive measures and promises of reform, highlighting the ongoing tension between stability and change that has characterized Kazakhstan since independence. Looking back at over 3 decades of independence, Kazakhstan's achievements are remarkable by any measure. The country successfully dismantled its nuclear weapons, transitioned from a Soviet command economy to a market economy, maintained stability in a volatile region, and built modern infrastructure, including a new capital city. The economy grew dramatically, living standards improved significantly, and Kazakhstan established itself as a significant regional power. However, challenges remain. Economic diversification is still a work in progress, political institutions are still developing, and social inequality persists despite overall prosperity. The country's dependence on natural resource exports makes it vulnerable to global commodity price fluctuations, while demographic changes and urbanization create new social pressures. Perhaps most importantly, Kazakhstan's independence period has demonstrated that it's possible for a post-Soviet state to chart its own course successfully. The country avoided the conflicts and instability that affected some other former Soviet republics, maintained its territorial integrity, and built a functioning state capable of providing prosperity and security for its citizens. While the journey toward full modernization continues, the foundation has been firmly established for Kazakhstan to continue developing as a sovereign, prosperous, and influential nation in the heart of Eurasia. Chapter 5: Culture, People, and Daily Life. Modern Kazakhstan is a fascinating cultural crossroads where ancient nomadic traditions coexist with gleaming skyscrapers, where centuries-old hospitality customs blend seamlessly with 21st century international business practices, and where a herder's descendant might be equally fluent in Kazakh epic poetry, Russian literature, and English software programming. It's a country where your Uber driver might spontaneously recite verses from the 14th century poet Korki Tata while navigating through Almaty traffic, which honestly makes for the best kind of cultural immersion experience. The people of Kazakhstan represent one of the most ethnically diverse populations in the world, a living testament to the country's position as a historical crossroads of civilizations. Ethnic Kazakhs now make up approximately 66% of the population, having gradually increased from being a minority in their own country at independence to becoming a comfortable majority. The remaining third of the population creates a remarkable mosaic of ethnicities, with ethnic Russians comprising about 21%, followed by significant communities of Uzbeks, Ukrainians, Uyghurs, Tatars, Germans, Koreans, and dozens of other groups. This demographic transformation tells the story of modern Kazakhstan in microcosm. During the Soviet period, massive population movements brought people from across the USSR to Kazakhstan, often against their will. Stalin's deportation policies relocated ethnic Germans from the Volga region, Koreans from the Far East, Chechens and Ingush from the Caucasus, and many others to the Kazakh steppes. The Virgin Lands campaign of the 1950s brought hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian agricultural workers to develop Kazakhstan's northern regions. By independence, Kazakhstan had become an incredible laboratory of multiculturalism, though not exactly by choice. The language situation in Kazakhstan reflects this complex demographic history and creates one of the world's most interesting examples of official bilingualism. Kazakh is the state language, symbolizing national identity and cultural continuity, while Russian serves as the official language of interethnic communication, recognizing the practical reality that it remains the lingua franca for most of the population. It's like having two different operating systems running simultaneously on the same computer, each handling different functions but somehow making the whole system work. The relationship between Kazakh and Russian languages is particularly fascinating because it demonstrates how two languages can coexist as what one observer called roommates, sometimes harmonious, sometimes competitive, but ultimately sharing the same space. While only about 63% of ethnic Kazakhs speak Kazakh as their daily language, over 93% of ethnic Kazakhs are highly competent in Russian, and 97% of the entire population is fluent in Russian. This means that Russian often serves as the common denominator in conversation, while Kazakh represents cultural roots and national identity. Walking through any Kazakhstani city, you'll hear this linguistic dance in action. Bus announcements come first in Kazakh, then in Russian. Street signs display both languages, often with English added below. Families might switch between languages mid-sentence, with Russian words flowing naturally into Kazakh conversations and vice versa. In rural areas, Kazakh dominates daily conversation, while in cities, especially in northern regions with larger Russian populations, Russian might be more common in business and education. The government's ambitious trilingual policy aims to create a generation fluent in Kazakh, Russian, and English, recognizing that global competitiveness requires international language skills while preserving cultural identity and interethnic harmony. It's an incredibly challenging linguistic juggling act that few countries have attempted on this scale, essentially trying to maintain historical linguistic diversity while building modern national unity. Traditional Kazakh culture emerged from centuries of nomadic life on the steppes, creating customs and values perfectly adapted to a mobile lifestyle that emphasized hospitality, respect for elders, and community cooperation. The saying, "A guest is a messenger from God," captures the fundamental importance of hospitality in Kazakh culture, a tradition that made survival possible in the harsh steppe environment, where travelers depended on the kindness of strangers for shelter, food, and protection. This hospitality tradition, called Konak's Haley Q, remains incredibly strong in modern Kazakhstan, though it has adapted to urban life and contemporary circumstances. When invited to a Kazakh home, guests are expected to remove their shoes, accept offered slippers, and prepare for what might be the most overwhelming display of generosity they've ever experienced. The host family will literally feel dishonored if guests don't eat substantial amounts of food and accept multiple cups of tea, creating a delightful cultural challenge for visitors who might not be prepared for such intensive hospitality. The traditional Kazakh meal structure reflects the nomadic heritage while incorporating influences from neighboring cultures and modern preferences. The centerpiece of any significant meal is the dastarkan, a low table where the family gathers to share food and conversation. The arrangement of the dastarkan follows ancient protocols, with guests seated in places of honor farthest from the door, and the eldest family members responsible for serving and blessing the meal. Kazakh cuisine revolves around the concept of turt tulik mal, the 4 types of livestock that sustained nomadic life: horses, camels, sheep, and cattle. Horse and mutton remain the preferred meats for special occasions, though beef and chicken have become common in daily cooking. The famous national dish, besh barmak, literally means 5 fingers because it was traditionally eaten by hand, consisting of boiled horse or mutton served over flat noodles with rich broth. The preparation and serving of besh barmak involves elaborate ceremony, especially when a sheep's head is presented to honour important guests. The eldest male family member carves the head according to ancient tradition, distributing specific parts to different guests based on symbolic meaning. Children might receive ears to encourage better listening, while honoured guests get the eye to seek wisdom, and younger people might get the tongue to become more eloquent. It's like an edible life coaching session delivered through traditional Kazakh hospitality. Horse meat holds particular cultural significance in Kazakhstan, appearing in dishes like kazi, a traditional horse meat sausage that's considered a delicacy and appears at virtually every celebration. For outsiders, the idea of eating horse meat can be jarring, but for Kazakhs it represents a direct connection to nomadic ancestors who viewed horses as partners in survival rather than just transportation. The preparation of kazi follows family recipes passed down through generations, with each family claiming their version is the most authentic. Dairy products play an equally important role in traditional Kazakh cuisine, reflecting the nomadic reliance on milk from mares, camels, sheep and cows. Kumis, fermented mare's milk with a slightly alcoholic content, remains popular for both its supposed health benefits and its cultural significance. Shubat, fermented camel's milk, provides similar nutrition and cultural connection. These traditional drinks might be an acquired taste for newcomers, but they represent thousands of years of nomadic food technology designed to preserve nutrition during long migrations. Modern Kazakh daily life blends these traditional elements with contemporary urban conveniences and international influences. A typical family in Almaty or Nur-Sultan might start the day with traditional Kurt-dried cheese balls alongside modern breakfast cereals, switch between Kazakh and Russian while checking international news in English, and end the evening watching Turkish soap operas dubbed in Russian while sharing traditional tea served in beautiful ceramic bowls. The preservation of traditional music and oral literature demonstrates how ancient nomadic culture adapts to modern life. Almost every Kazakh can play the dombra, the 2-stringed national instrument that accompanied storytellers across the steppes for centuries. Epic poems like Korkaytata and Oguznam that were once memorized by traveling musicians now exist in written form and digital recordings, but the tradition of musical storytelling continues in schools, cultural centers, and family gatherings. Traditional crafts have similarly evolved to meet contemporary needs while preserving cultural authenticity. The construction of yurts, the portable felt dwellings that house nomadic families, is now primarily done by women's cooperatives that sell them for cultural events, tourism, and family celebrations rather than daily housing. Most Kazakhs live in modern apartments or houses, but many families maintain a yurt for special occasions, summer retreats, or cultural education for their children. Religious life in Kazakhstan reflects the country's complex cultural evolution and official commitment to secularism while respecting diverse faiths. Approximately 60% of the population identifies as Muslim, primarily Sunni Islam of the Hanafi school, though Islamic practice varies greatly from strict observance to cultural identification. Many ethnic Kazakhs embrace Islam as part of their cultural identity while maintaining relatively secular lifestyles, creating a distinctly Kazakhstani approach to religious practice. The Russian Orthodox Church serves the large Slavic population, comprising about 25% of believers, while smaller communities practice Judaism, Buddhism, various Christian denominations, and other faiths. There's also been a revival of interest in Tengrism, the ancient Turkic belief system that worshipped the eternal blue sky and Mother Earth, though this remains more cultural curiosity than active religious practice for most people. Family structure in Kazakhstan has evolved significantly from traditional nomadic patterns, while retaining strong emphasis on respect for elders and extended family connections. Traditional Kazakh society was organized around kinship groups called zhus, and while these clan affiliations are less important in modern urban life, family connections and mutual support systems remain central to social organization. Marriage customs blend traditional practices with contemporary preferences, creating interesting cultural negotiations within families. While arranged marriages were historically common and still occur in rural areas, urban young people typically choose their own partners. However, family approval remains important, and traditional wedding ceremonies can last for days, involving elaborate gift exchanges, ritual foods, and celebrations that bring together extended families and entire communities. The traditional restriction against marriage within 7 generations of relatives is still observed, which in practice means that many Kazakhs can trace their genealogy back several centuries and know exactly how they're related to neighbours and acquaintances. This creates a social fabric where personal relationships are embedded in historical family connections, making Kazakhstan feel like an enormous extended family network. Education in Kazakhstan reflects the country's multilingual character and ambitious development goals. Schools typically offer instruction in Kazakh or Russian, with the other language taught as a required subject. English education has been dramatically expanded as part of the government's trilingual policy, while universities increasingly offer programs in multiple languages to prepare students for international careers. The education system produces remarkably well-educated population, with literacy rates approaching 100% and strong emphasis on mathematics, sciences and languages. Many young Kazakhstanis are genuinely trilingual, switching effortlessly between Kazakh for family and cultural contexts, Russian for business and interethnic communication, and English for international opportunities. This linguistic flexibility gives them enormous advantages in global markets while preserving cultural identity. Sports and recreational activities in Kazakhstan combine traditional nomadic games with modern international sports. Traditional horseback sports like kokpa, similar to polo but played with a goat carcass, and horse racing across vast distances remain popular, especially during cultural festivals. These games celebrate the horsemanship skills that were essential for nomadic survival and demonstrate the continued importance of horses in Kazakh cultural identity. Winter sports have become increasingly important, with Kazakhstan hosting international competitions and sending athletes to Olympic Games. The continental climate provides excellent conditions for skiing, ice hockey, and figure skating, while the flat steppes offer ideal terrain for cross-country skiing and winter cycling. Summer activities include hiking in the mountains, swimming in alpine lakes, and exploring the vast landscapes that shaped nomadic culture. Cultural festivals throughout the year celebrate both traditional holidays and modern achievements, with Nowruz, the Spring New Year celebration, being the most important. Nowruz combines ancient astronomical observations with Islamic influences and contemporary national pride, featuring traditional foods, music, games, and community gatherings that demonstrate how historical customs evolve to meet contemporary needs. The celebration of Nowruz illustrates the genius of Kazakh cultural adaptation. Traditional foods like Nowruz koj, made with 7 symbolic ingredients representing renewal and abundance, are prepared using both ancient recipes and modern convenience foods. Traditional games and horse sports are organised in urban parks and sports complexes rather than open steppes. Traditional music is performed using both ancient instruments and modern sound systems. The holiday successfully bridges nomadic heritage with urban reality. Urban life in Kazakhstan's major cities represents a fascinating blend of international modernity and cultural distinctiveness. Almaty and Nur-Sultan offer sophisticated restaurants serving everything from traditional Kazakh cuisine to international fusion dishes. Shopping centres filled with global brands alongside traditional craft vendors, and entertainment venues featuring both traditional performers and international artists. The capital city of Nur-Sultan, with its futuristic architecture and planned urban design, embodies Kazakhstan's ambitions for modernization, while incorporating traditional elements like the Bayturek monument, inspired by Kazakh legends about a mythical tree of life. The city's design reflects the challenge facing all of Kazakhstan: how to build a modern, internationally competitive nation while preserving the cultural heritage that provides identity and continuity. Daily life for most urban Kazakhstanis involves navigating between traditional expectations and contemporary opportunities. A young professional might start the day checking global stock markets in English, conduct business meetings in Russian, call family members in Kazakh, attend a traditional wedding ceremony in the evening, and end the day watching Korean dramas with Russian subtitles. This cultural complexity is not confusion but sophistication, representing the successful adaptation of nomadic flexibility to modern global citizenship. Chapter 6: Modern Kazakhstan, Economy and Future. Standing at the crossroads between Asia and Europe, Kazakhstan has transformed itself from a struggling post-Soviet republic into one of the world's most economically dynamic countries, though this transformation comes with both remarkable achievements and ongoing challenges. The country's economy today is like a sophisticated juggling act performed on a tightrope, balancing enormous natural resource wealth with the urgent need for diversification, managing relationships with global superpowers while maintaining independence, and pursuing ambitious modernization goals while preserving cultural identity. It's an economic performance that would be impressive even without the added complexity of doing it all while the rest of the world watches and occasionally tries to offer unsolicited advice. The foundation of Kazakhstan's modern economy rests on natural resources so abundant that the country sometimes seems like Mother Nature's favorite child who got extra gifts at Christmas. Kazakhstan is the world's largest producer of uranium, accounting for 35% of global production, with reserves that could fuel nuclear reactors for decades. The oil and gas sector provides the economic backbone, contributing around 35% of GDP and 75% of exports. Add to this significant reserves of copper, zinc, gold, silver, and virtually every element on the periodic table, and Kazakhstan possesses what economists call resource endowment, on a scale that makes other countries envious. The oil wealth story reads like a modern fairy tale of geological fortune and strategic development. Major fields like Tengiz and Kashagan contain reserves measured in billions of barrels, with Tengiz alone estimated to hold between 6 and 9 billion barrels of recoverable oil. The Tengiz-Chevron joint venture, involving Chevron Texaco, ExxonMobil, Kazmunai Gas, and Lucarco, represents one of the world's largest foreign investments in oil development. When oil prices surged during the 2000s and 2010s, Kazakhstan experienced economic growth rates that made even Chinese officials take notice. However, this resource wealth comes with the classic resource curse challenges that have affected other oil-rich nations. Overdependence on commodity exports makes the economy vulnerable to price fluctuations that Kazakhstan cannot control. When oil prices collapsed in 2014 and again during the COVID-19 pandemic, the economy experienced sharp contractions that reminded everyone why economists preach the virtues of diversification. The government learned the hard way that building an economy around natural resource extraction is like building a house on sand, impressive when conditions are good, but potentially unstable when external forces change. To address these vulnerabilities, Kazakhstan established the National Fund in 2001, modelled after Norway's successful sovereign wealth fund. The fund accumulates excess oil revenues during boom periods to provide economic stability during downturns and fund long-term development projects. By the late 2010s, the fund contained over $60 billion, providing crucial financial reserves that helped Kazakhstan weather economic storms while funding infrastructure development and social programs. The mining sector beyond oil and gas represents another pillar of Kazakhstan's economy, though with its own complexities and opportunities. The country's uranium industry, dominated by the state company Kazatomprom, has become central to global nuclear energy supply chains. Kazakhstan's uranium mining uses in situ leaching technology, which is more environmentally friendly than traditional mining but requires sophisticated groundwater management. As the world increasingly turns to nuclear energy as a clean alternative to fossil fuels, Kazakhstan's uranium reserves position it as a crucial player in global energy transition. Yet the most fascinating aspect of Kazakhstan's economic development might be its space industry, centered around the Baikonur Cosmodrome. This Soviet-era facility, leased to Russia for $115 million annually until 2050, represents both an economic asset and a geopolitical complexity. Baikonur generates revenue not just from the Russian lease but from commercial satellite launches and international space cooperation programs. The facility has launched virtually every major Soviet and Russian space mission, from Sputnik to the International Space Station cruise, making Kazakhstan an unlikely but crucial player in humanity's space exploration efforts. The Baikonur situation illustrates Kazakhstan's broader challenge of balancing historical relationships with future opportunities. While the facility provides steady income and international prestige, it also limits Kazakhstan's ability to develop independent space capabilities. Recent tensions between Russia and Kazakhstan over facility management, environmental concerns from rocket fuel contamination, and changing geopolitical relationships have created uncertainty about Baikonur's long-term role in Kazakhstan's development strategy. Agriculture represents another major economic sector with enormous potential for growth and modernization. Kazakhstan possesses some of the world's most fertile agricultural land, with approximately 75% of its territory classified as arable, though only about 30% is currently under production. The country ranks among the world's top wheat exporters, and its vast steppes could theoretically feed much of Central Asia and beyond. However, agricultural development faces significant challenges including water scarcity, aging infrastructure, and climate change impacts that could reduce yields by 9 to 47% by 2030. The government's response to these economic challenges and opportunities is embodied in the ambitious Kazakhstan 2050 strategy, announced by President Nazarbayev in 2012. This comprehensive development plan aims to transform Kazakhstan into one of the world's 30 most developed countries by mid-century, a goal that requires fundamental changes across virtually every sector of society and economy. The strategy represents a remarkable display of national ambition, essentially promising to compress decades of development that took Western countries over a century to achieve. The 2050 strategy identifies 7 priority areas: economic policy based on pragmatism and competitiveness, comprehensive support for entrepreneurship, new social policies balancing guarantees with personal responsibility, education reform focused on knowledge and skills, energy security and green technology development, institutional modernization, and foreign policy promoting regional leadership. It's like trying to rebuild an entire country while it's still running, requiring coordination across government, business, and society that few nations have successfully managed. Economic diversification efforts under the strategy include developing manufacturing capabilities beyond resource processing, expanding service sectors including finance and tourism, and building technology industries that can compete globally. The government has established special economic zones, provided tax incentives for foreign investment, and created institutions like Samruk Khazina, a sovereign wealth fund that manages state assets and invests in strategic sectors. These efforts have shown some success, with manufacturing growing as a percentage of GDP and new industries emerging in automotive assembly, food processing, and technology services. The green energy transition represents perhaps the most ambitious aspect of Kazakhstan's economic modernization. Despite being a major oil and gas producer, Kazakhstan has committed to generating 50% of its electricity from renewable sources by 2050. The country possesses excellent solar and wind resources, particularly in its vast steppe regions where consistent winds and abundant sunshine provide ideal conditions for renewable energy development. Several major solar and wind projects are already under construction, supported by international partnerships and financing. However, the transition to renewable energy faces significant practical challenges. Kazakhstan's electricity grid was designed around large centralized power plants, burning cheap domestic coal and natural gas. Integrating variable renewable energy sources requires expensive grid modernization, energy storage systems, and backup generation capacity. Additionally, much of Kazakhstan's workforce is skilled in fossil fuel industries, requiring extensive retraining programs to support the green energy transition. The government estimates that achieving its renewable energy goals will require over $100 billion in investment over the next 3 decades. Foreign investment plays a crucial role in Kazakhstan's economic development, with the country attracting over $370 billion in foreign direct investment since independence. Major investors include oil and gas companies from the United States, Europe, and China, mining companies from Canada and Australia, and increasingly, technology companies and renewable energy developers from various countries. Kazakhstan's investment climate has improved significantly since the early post-independence years, with streamlined regulations, tax incentives, and protection for foreign investors. China has become Kazakhstan's largest trading partner and a major source of investment, particularly in energy and infrastructure projects related to the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese companies have invested billions in Kazakhstani oil fields, built pipelines to transport Kazakhstani energy to China, and constructed transportation infrastructure that connects Central Asia to Chinese markets. This economic relationship provides Kazakhstan with crucial development capital and export markets, while giving China secure access to energy and raw materials. The relationship with China illustrates Kazakhstan's broader foreign economic strategy of multi-vector diplomacy, maintaining beneficial relationships with multiple major powers without becoming dependent on any single partner. Kazakhstan trades extensively with China, Russia, the European Union, and the United States, each relationship providing different economic benefits and reducing dependence on any single market. This approach requires sophisticated diplomacy but provides economic resilience and flexibility that smaller countries often lack. Russia remains an important economic partner despite political tensions related to Ukraine and other issues. Russian companies operate in Kazakhstan's energy sector. The countries share transportation infrastructure, including pipelines and railroads, and millions of Kazakhstanis work in Russia, sending remittances home. The economic relationship with Russia is complicated by history and geography, but remains practically important for both countries. The European Union represents Kazakhstan's most developed market relationship, with EU companies investing in Kazakhstan's energy sector, and the EU serving as a major market for Kazakhstani exports. The EU-Kazakhstan Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, signed in 2015, provides a framework for expanded economic cooperation, including trade facilitation, investment protection, free TPZ, and technology transfer. European companies bring advanced technology and environmental standards that help Kazakhstan modernize its industries. Kazakhstan's relationship with the United States focuses primarily on energy cooperation, nuclear security, and business development. American companies, particularly in the oil sector, have been among the largest foreign investors in Kazakhstan since independence. The United States has provided technical assistance for nuclear security, helping Kazakhstan dismantle inherited Soviet nuclear weapons and develop civilian nuclear capabilities. Business relationships include not just energy but also agriculture, technology, and education partnerships. Looking toward the future, Kazakhstan faces several major economic challenges that will determine whether it achieves its 2050 goals. The first challenge is successfully diversifying the economy away from resource dependence, while the world itself transitions away from fossil fuels. Kazakhstan must essentially run two races simultaneously, developing new economic sectors while managing the decline of traditional resource industries. This requires careful timing and enormous investment in education, infrastructure, and innovation. The second challenge involves managing demographic changes that will reshape the economy over the next several decades. Kazakhstan's population is aging, with the elderly population expected to nearly double by 2050, requiring increased healthcare spending and social support systems. Simultaneously, urbanization continues as young people migrate from rural areas to cities seeking education and employment opportunities. The government must provide urban infrastructure for growing cities while maintaining rural communities that produce the country's food. Climate change presents both challenges and opportunities for Kazakhstan's future development. Rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns threaten traditional agriculture while potentially opening new agricultural opportunities in northern regions. Water scarcity, already a concern in southern Kazakhstan, may become more severe, requiring expensive irrigation infrastructure and crop adaptation. However, Kazakhstan's abundant solar and wind resources become more valuable as the world seeks alternatives to fossil fuels. Technological development represents another crucial challenge and opportunity. Kazakhstan must build domestic technology capabilities while competing with countries that have decades of experience in high-tech industries. The government has established technology parks, provided incentives for research and development, and partnered with international technology companies to transfer knowledge and skills. Success requires not just infrastructure investment, but cultural changes that encourage innovation and entrepreneurship. Regional cooperation within Central Asia offers opportunities for economic development that Kazakhstan is beginning to explore more actively. The 5 Central Asian countries together represent a market of over 70 million people with complementary resources and capabilities. Kazakhstan's economic leadership position enables it to promote regional integration projects that could benefit all countries while expanding markets for Kazakhstani products and services. The future of Baikonur Cosmodrome represents both opportunity and uncertainty for Kazakhstan's long-term development. As the global space industry expands beyond government programs to include commercial satellite launches, space tourism, and eventually asteroid mining, Kazakhstan's space infrastructure could become increasingly valuable. However, this requires either renegotiating the Russian lease arrangement or developing independent space capabilities that can compete with other launch providers around the world. Education and human capital development may be the most critical factor determining Kazakhstan's economic future. The country's 2050 goals require a workforce capable of operating in high-technology industries, renewable energy systems, and knowledge-based services. This demands continued investment in universities, technical training, and lifelong learning programs that can adapt to rapidly changing economic conditions. Kazakhstan's traditional emphasis on education provides a foundation, but the pace of global technological change requires constant adaptation and upgrading of skills. Financial sector development represents another crucial element of Kazakhstan's economic modernization. The country needs sophisticated banking, insurance, and capital market institutions capable of financing large-scale infrastructure projects, supporting small and medium enterprises, and managing the risks associated with economic diversification. Recent banking sector reforms have strengthened financial institutions, but further development is needed to support the ambitious goals of the 2050 strategy. Environmental sustainability increasingly influences Kazakhstan's economic development options. International investors and trading partners increasingly demand environmental protection standards that affect access to global markets. Kazakhstan's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060 requires fundamental changes in energy production, industrial processes, and transportation systems. While these changes involve significant costs, they also position Kazakhstan to benefit from the global transition to sustainable development. Perhaps most importantly, Kazakhstan's economic future depends on maintaining the political stability and social cohesion that have enabled its remarkable progress since independence. The country's multi-ethnic population, complex regional relationships, and ambitious development goals require continued political leadership that can build consensus around long-term strategies while managing short-term challenges and setbacks.